The morning was quiet in a way that felt heavy. Gray clouds hung low over the cemetery, and a soft wind moved through the tall trees like a slow breath. Rows of flags stood straight, their colors muted under the dull sky. People arrived in dark clothes, walking carefully, speaking in low voices. This was not just any funeral. A respected general was being laid to rest, and every step, every sound, carried weight. At the far end of the road, a man stopped walking and looked ahead. He held the small hand of his young child, who stayed close to his side. The man's suit was clean but old, pressed carefully at home. His shoes showed signs of long use, but they were polished as best as he could manage. His hair was neatly combed, and his face was calm, though tired. He carried a thin folder under his arm, edges worn, papers inside protected by care rather than money. The child looked around with wide eyes, taking in the uniforms, the shiny cars, the flags. It was the child's first time at a place like this. "Is this where the hero sleeps?" The child asked softly. The man nodded and squeezed the small hand. "Yes," he said. "This is where we say goodbye." They walked toward the entrance gate, where two guards stood in crisp uniforms. Their posture was sharp, their faces serious. They checked names, badges, and invitations. People passed through, after quick glances, some with nods of respect, others without a word. When the man and child stepped forward, one of the guards raised a hand. "Invitation?" The guard asked, not unkindly, but firm. The man paused. "I don't have a printed invitation," he said. His voice was steady. "But I served with the general. I came to pay my respects." The guard looked him over from head to toe. The old suit, the worn shoes, the thin folder. His eyes moved briefly to the child. "This ceremony is restricted," the guard replied. "Only approved guests are allowed inside." The man nodded as if he expected this. He opened the folder slowly and took out a few papers. His hands were careful, almost gentle, as if the pages meant more than words. "These are my service records," he said quietly. "I was under his command years ago. I won't cause any trouble. I'll stand in the back." The second guard stepped closer and glanced at the papers, but only briefly. He did not take them. "Sir," he said, "we can't verify this here. You'll need proper clearance." Behind them, a small line began to form. A few people shifted their weight, watching. Some looked curious. Others looked annoyed, eager to move forward. The child tightened their grip on the man's hand. "Did we do something wrong?" The child whispered. The man bent slightly and spoke softly. "No, sometimes people just don't know yet." He straightened and faced the guards again. "If it's all right," he said, "we can stand outside. I just wanted to be close." The first guard shook his head. "You can't remain near the entrance," he said. "Please step aside." The words landed harder than expected. The man's jaw tightened for a moment, then relaxed. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply nodded and guided the child away from the gate. They moved to the side, near a low stone wall. From there, they could see the tops of flags and hear faint sounds from inside. The man stood straight, hands resting on the folder, eyes forward. To anyone watching closely, his posture carried something familiar, something learned long ago. People continued to pass through the gate. Some glanced at the man and child, then looked away. A woman in black paused for a second, her eyes lingering on the child, then she followed the rest inside. A few officers walked by, their medals catching the light, their conversations quiet but confident. The child looked up again. "Why don't they let you in?" The man took a slow breath. "Because they don't know our story," he said. "And that's okay." He looked toward the gate, and for a moment the present faded. His mind drifted back to years ago, to dusty roads and long nights, to commands given under pressure and choices that could not be undone. He remembered a younger version of himself, standing in formation, heart pounding, trusting the voice that led them forward. That voice belonged to the man being honored today, not back then. He never thought about funerals or recognition. He thought about getting everyone home. He thought about the men beside him. He thought about doing what needed to be done. A sharp sound brought him back. A guard inside the gate called out instructions. Chairs scraped lightly against the ground. The ceremony was beginning. The man adjusted the child's jacket against the cool air. "Are you cold?" he asked. The child shook their head. "I'm okay. I just want to see." The man lifted the child slightly so they could peek over the wall. From that angle, the child could see uniforms lined in order, heads bowed, flags folded with care. A distant voice began to speak, slow and respectful. The child listened, eyes wide. "They're talking about him," the child said. "Yes," the man replied. "They're telling people who he was." "And who were you?" the child asked, without meaning anything by it. The man smiled faintly. "I was someone who followed." The wind picked up, rustling the flags. The man closed his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered standing in harsh sunlight years ago, hearing that same wind, feeling the same weight in his chest. He remembered the general's face, calm, even when everything else was chaos. He remembered a hand on his shoulder after a mission, a simple nod that said more than words. He opened his eyes again and looked at the gate. The guards stood unmoved, focused on their duty. They were doing their job, just as he once had. He did not blame them. Still, a quiet ache settled in his chest, not for himself, but for the lesson his child was learning in that moment. A man in a decorated uniform walked past the gate, then slowed. He glanced back at the father and child, his brow furrowing slightly. He did not stop, but the look lingered. The child leaned against the man's side. "I'm glad we came," the child said. The man kissed the top of the child's head. "So am I." The voice from inside the cemetery grew louder, speaking of honor, duty, and sacrifice. Each word seemed to drift toward the gate, slipping through the space where the man stood. He listened closely, standing still, as if once again in formation, waiting for a command that might never come. Around him, the world continued. Cars arrived. Shoes stepped on gravel. Flags moved with the wind. And just outside the gate, a single father and a child stood quietly, carrying a history no one had asked to see yet. The man and his child remained near the stone wall, watching the funeral from outside. The child's small hand stayed in his, tight and trusting. The air was cooler now, and a light drizzle began to fall, making the grass glisten. The child shivered slightly, and the man adjusted the jacket again, keeping a steady gaze on the ceremony. He didn't want the child to see disappointment or anger, so he kept his expression calm, but inside, memories pulled at him, years ago. He had been young and full of determination, joining the military with a promise to protect and serve. He had quickly learned that service meant sacrifice, long nights, and decisions that could not be undone. He had been stationed in dangerous areas, always under orders, always aware that any moment could change everything. He remembered the day he first met the general, who was now being honored. The man had been strict, demanding, and fair. The kind of leader who expected the best and gave respect only when it was earned. The man had been scared during his first deployment, unsure of himself and the choices he would have to make. But the general had seen something in him, something quiet but steadfast. Over time, the general had become a guide, teaching him courage, patience, and loyalty. Under that guidance, the man had learned to lead others, to make decisions under pressure, and to trust in the people around him. He thought of one particular mission, long and dangerous, where failure would have cost lives. The general had briefed them with calm authority, and though fear had gnawed at him, the man had followed the plan exactly. He remembered the night clearly, the tension, the silence, and the small handshakes of reassurance between soldiers. The mission had succeeded, and countless lives had been saved because of careful planning and quiet bravery. The general had never praised him personally in front of others, but there had been moments of acknowledgement. A nod, a firm clap on the shoulder, a subtle sign that said, "You did well." After that mission, he had returned home changed. He had chosen to leave active service to care for his child when life circumstances required it. Being a single parent had been difficult, but it was a responsibility he embraced fully. He learned to balance work, parenting, and the memories of service that sometimes felt too heavy to carry alone. Most of all, he had learned humility, keeping the past close to his heart, but never speaking of it aloud. Recognition had never mattered. Doing the right thing had been enough. Not the child tugged gently on his hand. "Were you really a hero?" The child asked, eyes wide with curiosity. The man knelt down slightly, keeping his voice soft. "I didn't do it to be a hero," he said. "I did it because it was the right thing. That's all any of us can do." They both turned their attention back to the funeral. The voices inside carried words of honor, telling stories of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. He listened carefully, remembering similar speeches from years ago, standing in formation, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It had been different then, different in ways he could not explain to a child. The world outside had been harsher, more unforgiving, but the lessons had been valuable. People inside were crying quietly, some holding photographs, others holding hands in comfort. The man's thoughts drifted to the soldiers he had served with, some of whom had not returned home. He thought of the nights when fear had been a constant companion, and how every choice had felt like the difference between life and death. That past was alive in him, though it was quiet now, tucked away beneath layers of everyday life, but never forgotten. A car pulled up near the entrance, drawing a few glances. The man didn't move. He had learned long ago to stay steady, to be patient, to trust that what mattered would be seen when the time was right. He looked down at the child. "Do you see all these people?" he asked. "They are remembering someone who mattered a lot to many." The child nodded. "Do they know you knew him?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "Sometimes people don't see things right away. That's okay. What matters is that we remember and honor, even if quietly." A few minutes passed, and the drizzle became a steady mist. The child's small hand slipped into his coat pocket, cold but trusting. He could feel the weight of the child's curiosity, the need to understand a world he hadn't yet experienced. The man knew that these were lessons in patience and resilience, lessons that he wanted to teach not with words alone, but through quiet example. He recalled other times in his life when he had been overlooked, dismissed, or turned away. The sting had been real then, but now it felt different. He had learned that dignity was not in being noticed by everyone, but in standing by your principles, in keeping promises, and in holding the line when it mattered. That same principle applied now as he stood outside the gate. Waiting. The voices from the ceremony carried snippets of the general's life, his achievements, his wisdom, his ability to inspire loyalty and courage in those around him. The man listened closely, every word resonating, every pause echoing memories of his own experiences. He thought of the people who had walked beside him, their faces clear in his mind, despite the years. He thought of their sacrifices, their laughter, their fears, and their strength. The child whispered again, "Do you think they'll let us in?" The man smiled faintly, brushing a wet strand of hair from the child's forehead. "We'll see," he said. "For now, we remember and honor quietly. That's what matters. A gust of wind passed through, and he could smell the damp earth, the fresh grass, the scent of flowers brought for the ceremony. It reminded him of other times in life when scents and sounds had brought memories rushing back. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the memories wash over him, the camaraderie, the fear, the relief, the pride. Then he opened them, keeping his gaze forward, steady and calm. People inside the gate began to rise, signaling the end of a segment of the ceremony. The man adjusted his grip on the folder, checking the documents again. They were simple, but they carried the proof of his story, proof of service and sacrifice that went unseen by most. A small group of visitors noticed him standing at the edge, a man and child in quiet dignity. Whispers traveled through the group. "Do you know him?" Someone asked. "Why is he standing outside?" The man paid no attention, focusing on the ceremony, on teaching the child what respect and patience meant. He could feel the weight of eyes, the questioning, the judgment, but he did not waver. Years of discipline and life experience had taught him that presence, even in silence, spoke louder than words. He thought about the general one last time before the next segment of the ceremony began. The lessons he had learned, the guidance received, the courage inspired, all of it flowed through him in quiet waves. And now, standing outside, he realized that these lessons were not only for him. They were for the child, who watched, who learned, who would carry this understanding into life. The drizzle eased, leaving the air fresh and clean. The man took a deep breath, inhaling slowly, feeling the weight of the past and the presence of the moment. He looked down at the child and smiled faintly. "Ready?" he asked. The child nodded, small eyes shining with curiosity and understanding. The man squeezed the hand gently, then straightened, shoulders back, eyes forward. Outside the gate, in the quiet of the misty morning, they stood together, two lives connected by love, history, and the lessons of courage and patience. And even though they were not inside, the man knew that they were exactly where they needed to be. The morning continued, soft clouds lingering, the drizzle now only a light mist. The father and child remained near the edge of the cemetery, standing quietly by the stone wall. The sounds of the ceremony floated over the small distance, voices filled with respect and solemnity. He could hear the phrases that honored the general's life, recounting bravery, dedication, and leadership. Each word seemed heavy, yet clear, and carried the weight of a lifetime. People inside began to notice him standing outside. It was subtle at first, just glances, small moments of recognition. A few officers stopped briefly, their heads tilting as if they remembered something. The father noticed, but kept his eyes forward. He didn't need acknowledgement, only to honor the memory of a man who had once been his guide. The child leaned closer, whispering, "Why are they looking at you?" "They are trying to understand," the father replied gently. "Sometimes people need time to see what is right in front of them." The mist seemed to carry the murmurs of curiosity. A woman with a bouquet slowed her step, looking past the gates at the man and child. She whispered to the person beside her, who nodded. Officers walked past, their polished shoes and uniforms immaculate, but there was something in their eyes that betrayed a spark of recognition. He had seen it before, in distant fields and battle zones, the moment when someone realized the truth of who stood before them. Inside the cemetery, the ceremony continued. Flags waved lightly, tapping against poles with a gentle breeze. The words of the speakers painted pictures of courage, strategy, and loyalty. The father closed his eyes briefly, recalling the days he had spent under the general's command. Missions that had seemed impossible, nights filled with tension, and moments when silence had spoken louder than words. The memories were sharp, vivid, and yet distant enough that he could stand outside without faltering. A group of young officers paused near the entrance. One of them noticed the folder the father carried. A thin paper peeked out, the edges frayed from years of careful handling. Curious, the officer whispered to another, pointing subtly. They looked closer, the expressions changing from casual interest to sudden awareness. One of them stepped slightly forward, but was stopped by a senior guard. The father noticed the subtle movement and nodded slightly to the child. "See," he said quietly, "sometimes what matters most is noticed, even when it seems hidden." The child's eyes were wide. "Do they know you?" "I think they are beginning to," he said softly. "It just takes a moment for some people." As the ceremony progressed, more people began to notice him. Not all were obvious, but the glances became longer, the whispers a little louder. A retired officer approached the gate, stopping abruptly as he caught sight of the father's posture, the calmness in his stance, the quiet dignity. Something in the man's bearing told a story of service, of discipline, of sacrifice. The officer squinted slightly, then looked away, unsure if he should speak or wait. The child tugged on his coat again. "I think they are noticing you," the child whispered. He smiled faintly, resting a hand on the child's shoulder. "Perhaps," he said. "We'll see what happens next." Meanwhile, a small crowd inside began to murmur more openly. Some officers whispered to one another, nodding toward the entrance. The father remained still, patient. He had learned long ago that attention, recognition, or respect, when forced, rarely held value. It was the quiet moments that revealed truth. A senior officer, carrying the weight of experience, noticed the man. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of curiosity passing across his face. He stepped closer to the gate, squinting at the documents tucked under the father's arm. Recognition began to dawn. There was something familiar about the insignia on the folder, something that matched records he had seen years ago. The murmurs grew. People began to whisper questions. "Do you know him? Was he part of the unit? He looks like he served closely with the general." The father watched silently, feeling the tension grow, but maintaining calm. He remembered the general's advice, the guidance, the trust placed in him long ago. This was not about proving himself. It was about standing with dignity and letting truth show itself. A younger officer nudged another, pointing subtly. They moved closer to the gate, their curiosity clear but cautious. The child noticed and squeezed his father's hand. "Are they going to let us in?" "Not yet," the father said softly. "But patience is part of what we are learning today. Not everything happens all at once." From inside the ceremony, the sound of a bugle rose briefly, signaling a change in the ritual. Flags were adjusted, steps synchronized, voices blending into the solemn chorus of honor and remembrance. The father felt the vibrations of the music, the resonance carrying memories of marshes long ago, of orders given, of lives protected. He glanced down at the child, who was wide-eyed, taking in the moment, learning without words. The father knew that lessons of respect, service, and patience were often learned quietly, in moments of stillness and observation. He had carried such lessons for years, and now shared them, not with calm commands or speeches, but through presence. An older officer approached the gate finally, studying the man closely. Recognition flickered across his face. He whispered to a colleague, pointing toward the documents tucked carefully under the father's arm. A quiet nod passed between them. Slowly, they began to understand the story, the quiet hero who had stood by the general in critical moments, whose actions had saved lives, whose presence outside the gate now demanded acknowledgement. The child looked up at the father again. "Do they know who you are?" He smiled faintly. "I think they are beginning to see," he said. "But remember, it's not about them knowing first. It's about doing what is right and letting time reveal the truth." The crowd inside the ceremony grew restless, noticing more officers glancing toward the edge where the father stood. Some approached quietly, trying to understand the situation without disturbing the solemnity. The whispers grew, the glances longer, the attention more focused. The father stood, still calm, still quiet, letting his presence speak for itself. A young soldier whispered to a colleague, "That's him. He was part of the mission with the general." "I remember the reports." The colleague's eyes widened. "Outside? Here?" "Yes," the soldier replied. "Looks like no one realized until now." The father felt a small wave of warmth in his chest. Not for recognition, but for the lesson being learned by the child. That patience, integrity, and quiet courage held value even when unseen. The ceremony continued, but the energy outside the gate shifted. Whispers and glances multiplied. The presence of the father and child became a silent story being told without words. A story of service, courage, and quiet strength. People began to question, to reflect, to see beyond uniforms and gates. They began to realize that sometimes those who had served the most humbly could stand unnoticed until the right moment. The child leaned against the father. "I think they understand now," the child whispered. "Perhaps," the father said. "And even if they don't, we know what is true, and that is enough for us." The mist lifted slightly, the light breaking through clouds, illuminating the scene with a soft glow. The father adjusted the folder, ensuring it remained protected, a symbol of years of service and silent sacrifice. He stood, calm and steady, as if waiting for something inevitable. Inside, murmurs grew louder, more officers stopping to notice, recognizing the quiet hero who had been overlooked until now. The story of his service began to surface slowly, like sunlight breaking through the mist, revealing courage, sacrifice, and loyalty. The father's presence, the child's quiet trust, and the memories carried in the folder began to demand attention. Not through force or complaint, but through truth and dignity. The child whispered again, "Do you think we will be allowed in now?" The father took a deep breath, looking toward the gates where the guards still stood, and the ceremony continued beyond them. "Perhaps soon," he said softly. "But for now, we watch, we remember, and we hold ourselves with quiet pride." And so they remained, father and child, standing at the edge, not inside, yet carrying the story, the history, and the courage that would soon demand acknowledgement. Outside the gate, quiet courage was beginning to speak for itself. The mist was beginning to clear, revealing more of the cemetery and the rows of soldiers standing at attention. The father and child remained at the edge, quiet and still, their presence unnoticed by many, but slowly becoming the center of attention for those who knew to look. The child's hand stayed in his, fingers intertwined, small but trusting. The father adjusted the folder he carried, feeling the weight of both memories and the moment pressing gently against him. Inside the ceremony, officers moved with quiet precision, their eyes occasionally drifting to the entrance where the father stood. Whispers passed from one to another, growing in both curiosity and concern. The presence of the man, so calm and dignified, began to disrupt the smooth flow of the ceremony. People inside recognized that there was a story here, one they hadn't yet understood fully. A senior officer, his medals catching the soft sunlight, now breaking through the clouds, approached the gate. He stopped abruptly when he saw the man and child. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He whispered to a colleague, pointing toward the warm folder and the man's steady posture. The colleague nodded, equally surprised, and they both looked back at the ceremony, debating whether to interrupt the proceedings. The child leaned against his father, shivering slightly from the cool air. "Are they going to let us in?" The child asked softly, voice full of both hope and fear. The father smiled faintly, brushing a damp strand of hair from the child's forehead. "We'll see," he said. "Right now, we stand quietly and let truth find its way." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the line of officers inside the cemetery. A 4-star general, a man whose presence commanded immediate attention, walked briskly toward the entrance. His eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd and then settling on the father and child. The movement caused an instant shift. Officers straightened, whispers stopped, and the energy in the air changed. This was no ordinary interruption. This was a command, an authority that could not be ignored. That the 4-star general approached the guards with deliberate steps. "Stop everything," he said firmly. His voice carried through the mist, halting the ceremony for a brief moment. The guards, startled, paused, unsure of what was happening. They had never been commanded to stop a funeral before, and the presence of such a high-ranking officer left no room for argument. "Who is that man?" the general demanded, gesturing toward the father. "Why is he not inside?" The guards shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, he does not have an invitation," one of them replied. "We could not verify." The 4-star general held up a hand. "Do you know who he is?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. A pause. The guards looked at one another, then at the father, who stood perfectly still, holding the child close. He made no movement, no attempt to explain himself. His presence alone seemed to speak louder than words. The general's gaze softened slightly as he stepped closer. Recognition dawned. "This is the man who served under the general we are honoring today," he said. "He was part of the mission that saved countless lives. And now, you are telling him to stand outside?" The guards swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of their mistake. Their instructions, their protocols, all seemed insignificant under the weight of truth and honor. The 4-star general motioned, and one of the guards reluctantly stepped aside, opening the path. The father's eyes met the general's briefly. There was no pride in his expression, only calm acknowledgement. He nodded slightly, respecting the command without speaking. The child looked up, eyes wide, sensing the shift in energy, the importance of the moment. Even if they didn't fully understand it, officers nearby began to murmur, some stepping aside to allow the father and child to move forward. The ceremony continued, but now the attention had shifted. The whispers spread. "He's part of the mission. He stood beside the general. He's the one who helped save lives." Recognition was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The 4-star general walked beside the father now, guiding him and the child toward the center of attention. "You'll be seated with honor," he said quietly but firmly. "Your service will be acknowledged." The father nodded again, quiet and composed. He had never sought recognition. He had never stood for praise. But the acknowledgement now, in front of those who mattered, carried a weight that was both humbling and profoundly moving. As they moved closer, the child whispered, "Are we really going inside?" "Yes," the father said, his voice steady. "We are finally where we need to be." Inside the ceremony, the energy shifted further. Officers and attendees alike turned their attention toward the father and child. Murmurs spread quickly. Some recognized the insignia on the father's folder. Others recalled reports and stories from years ago. The man who had once served quietly, without expectation, was now being honored in the only way that mattered: through truth and respect. The child held tightly to his father's hand, eyes wide at the new world unfolding around them. Soldiers stood straighter, some saluting, some nodding in respect. The father remained composed, guiding the child gently, step by step, into the space they had been denied for so long. The ceremony itself resumed, but now with a new layer of depth. Every word spoken, every story told, resonated with the acknowledgement of the man standing among them. The general's actions had not only corrected an oversight, but had also demonstrated the importance of recognizing service, loyalty, and sacrifice. The father found a place to stand, not seeking attention, but simply present, carrying the quiet dignity that had defined his life. The child looked around, seeing the respect and understanding in the faces of those around them, learning a lesson that could never be taught in books or classrooms: the power of patience, courage, and integrity. The four-star general stood nearby, observing. There was no need for words. The recognition, a shift in atmosphere, and the acknowledgement of the father's service spoke volumes. For the first time in many years, the man felt fully seen, not for the glory, not for the praise, but for the truth of his contributions. As the ceremony continued, the father and child were embraced by the acknowledgement of those around them. Officers approached quietly, offering nods of respect. The child whispered once more, "I'm glad we came." The father smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment and the relief of having patience rewarded. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The light grew brighter as the sun began to break through the clouds, illuminating the scene with a gentle glow. The ceremony reached its peak, the voices carrying messages of honor, courage, and remembrance. And in that moment, the father and child were no longer outsiders. They were part of the story, part of the memory, and part of the acknowledgement that had been long overdue. The four-star general gave a slight nod, his eyes meeting the father's. It was a nod of respect, understanding, and silent gratitude. The father returned it, simple and composed, knowing that the recognition mattered not just for him, but for the lessons it would teach his child. Standing together, father and child, they felt the weight of the past and the honor of the present. Outside and inside merged as acknowledgement, truth, and respect finally found their rightful place. And for the first time that day, the father allowed himself a quiet, humble pride, knowing that he had stood his ground with dignity and had finally been seen for who he truly was. The father and child moved carefully through the path cleared for them, guided by the presence of the four-star general. Each step was deliberate, calm, carrying a quiet dignity that had defined the father's life for many years. The child's small hand remained in his, fingers gripping tightly. Sensing the importance of the moment, even without fully understanding it, as they reached the center of attention, officers and attendees turned to acknowledge them. Some offered nods of respect, others a quiet word or a brief gesture. The father remained composed, not seeking recognition, but accepting it gracefully, understanding that this moment was about more than him. It was about the lessons his child would carry for life. The ceremony resumed with renewed solemnity. The speaker's voice flowed over the crowd, telling stories of the general's leadership, courage, and the lives he had touched. The father listened carefully, feeling a connection between those words and the experiences he had lived through under that very leadership. He remembered long nights, impossible missions, and the sense of duty that had driven him forward when fear threatened to take over. The child tugged gently at his coat. "Will people know what you did?" "Yes," the father said quietly. "Now they will. And more importantly, you will understand." The audience shifted as more officers stepped closer to recognize the father's presence. They had been witnesses to his dedication, to the quiet heroism that had been overlooked for years. Now there was no denying it. The small folder he had carried so carefully, once ignored, became a symbol of service and sacrifice, proof of a life lived with integrity. The four-star general moved slightly closer, ensuring that the father and child were positioned respectfully. He nodded once, a simple gesture loaded with meaning. The father returned the nod, not with arrogance, but with calm acknowledgement. He had never sought the spotlight, but in this moment, the respect he had earned quietly was now made visible. The child looked around, eyes wide, taking in the faces of officers and attendees. "Everyone is looking at us," the child whispered. "They are noticing," the father said. And that is a good thing. Sometimes, people see the truth only when it cannot be ignored. Flowers lined the aisles, flags waved lightly in the breeze, and the ceremony's cadence continued, now with a new layer of meaning. The presence of the father and child had changed the energy. What had begun as an ordinary memorial had become a living acknowledgement of all who had served and sacrificed quietly. A group of older veterans approached slowly, nodding their heads in recognition. Some had served alongside the father. Others had known of his contributions through reports and records. They offered silent respect, small gestures that spoke volumes. The child's hand tightened around the father's. Feeling the warmth and reassurance of these moments, the father thought back to the missions he had undertaken, the nights of fear, the decisions made under pressure. Each memory now seemed to fit into this moment, a life of quiet service finally being recognized. He felt no anger for the delay in acknowledgement, only a calm satisfaction that truth had its way. Officers began to recount small details quietly to one another, stories of the father's actions, the courage displayed, and the lives saved. The child listened, eyes widening, understanding for the first time the weight of the man beside them. These were lessons beyond books, lessons of integrity, patience, and the quiet strength required to stand true in the face of disregard. The ceremony reached a reflective moment, a pause for silent respect. The father knelt slightly to whisper to the child, "See how people honor those who serve? It's not just about rank or ceremony. It's about living with courage and being remembered for the right reasons." The child nodded solemnly, eyes shining. "I want to be brave like you," the child said, that the father smiled faintly. Bravery comes in many forms. Sometimes it is in loud action, sometimes in quiet patience. Today, you are learning both. A photographer discreetly captured the moment, but the father paid no attention. The recognition did not require pictures or headlines. It existed in the acknowledgement of presence, in the nods of respect, in the quiet understanding that his years of service had mattered. The four-star general approached once more, speaking softly so only the father could hear. "You stood with honor then, and now. Your courage and dedication are seen. Thank you for your service." The father nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "Thank you, sir," he replied. "It was my duty." The ceremony began to conclude, with final honors to the general being remembered. Flags were lowered, and a slow, respectful silence filled the air. The father and child remained in their place, absorbing the moment fully, aware of the significance and the lessons it carried. People began to file out slowly, many offering nods or quiet words to the father. Some approached to shake his hand, others simply gave a respectful glance. The child watched, learning the power of quiet courage and the dignity that comes from service, patience, and integrity. The sun broke further through the clouds, casting warm light over the scene. The father held the child close, taking in the final moments of the ceremony, feeling a sense of peace. The recognition, delayed though it had been, carried a profound weight. It was not about applause, not about attention, but about the truth being acknowledged and the lessons being passed on as the crowd began to disperse. The father and child lingered for a moment, savoring the quiet sense of completion. The folder, now carried with a lighter feeling, symbolized years of commitment and sacrifice finally honored. The child looked up, eyes bright with understanding. "Will we come back?" The child asked. The father smiled, holding the small hand gently. "Perhaps," he said, "but for now, remember what you saw today. Bravery, patience, and respect are more important than any invitation or ceremony." They walked slowly away from the center, moving toward the edge of the cemetery. Officers and veterans nodded as they passed, some offering small words of thanks. The father remained composed, teaching by example, showing that acknowledgement and honor often come quietly, but are deeply meaningful. The child looked up again. "I understand now," the child said softly. "I understand about courage and doing the right thing." "Yes," the father replied, voice gentle. "And now you will carry that understanding with you." As they left the cemetery, the father glanced back one last time. The ceremony continued behind them, but their part in it had been fulfilled. Years of quiet service, patience, and sacrifice had been recognized, and a lesson had been passed to the next generation. The mist had cleared completely now, leaving a bright, soft day. Father and child walked together, hand in hand, hearts full of understanding and quiet pride. The story of their presence, once overlooked, had become a testament to the importance of courage, patience, and integrity. And in that moment, the father knew that he had not only honored the general, but had also given his child a gift far greater than any ceremony could provide, the understanding of what it truly means to serve and to be seen.